Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
And here, an old man with gray hair was running through the cemetery, leaping over the uneven ground with his feeble legs, carefully avoiding the graves and monuments. His wooden cane clearly helped him in this sprint, or else he would have been stuck at the entrance. But there was no time to lose. Every minute was crucial. Stop. Before we get to the main event of the story, let's discuss the characters who have been a part of it all along. So, there lived a man on this earth named Samuel Soto. There was a time, of course, when he was just Samuel. But the years marched on relentlessly, and he himself became kinder and sadder. Why sadder, you might ask? Well, old age and loneliness took their toll. However, it couldn't be said that Samuel Soto was completely without loved ones in his old age. About 10 years ago, when the old man was only 59, his beloved wife passed away. He had never loved anyone as deeply as he had loved her throughout his life. And he had been married 3 times. His first wife was his high school sweetheart, named Rufina. They studied together at college, then lived together for a short while. But Samuel Soto's job demanded that he move urgently to the north for a very long time. His girlfriend couldn't afford to move from her beloved south, where she cared for elderly relatives and worked at a school. So, the long-distance relationship between Samuel and Rufina couldn't withstand such a colossal distance. Thus, they peacefully parted ways after just a few years, without any regrets. Samuel's second wife was a simple girl, a cafeteria worker at their construction factory. She was attractive, hardworking, and a little mysterious. That's what attracted young Samuel to Valeriana. As soon as he fell in love, he married her on the spot. So, just 3.5 months after they met, the happy and content newlyweds were walking down the aisle while their colleagues in the workshop were clinking glasses and whistled joyfully. Valeriana was a wonderful person and a true homemaker. However, she had lived in a city with poor ecology for too long, and she couldn't have children no matter how hard the couple tried, no matter how many doctors they consulted, or what medications they took. Valeriana didn't particularly dream of having children. She enjoyed working, cooking delicious meals, reading books, and living life on her own terms. But Samuel's idea of family life differed somewhat. He always wanted to have children. He had 2 younger sisters whom he had cared for and loved deeply from a young age. And in the South, young men were always raised to dream only of hard work and family. So, after almost 7 years together, the relationship between Samuel and Valeriana became complex and tangled, and the couple decided to get a divorce. And then our hero turned 36. It was quite a lot for a man who had dreamed of raising 2 sons and 2 daughters. He had already become disillusioned with life and the twists and turns fate had thrown at him. But then happiness knocked on his door once again. During a shift in another city, he met the lovely Otelia, with wheat-colored hair, eyes the shade of sweet honey, and pink, plump lips. In short, it was love at first sight and first word. However, this time it took Samuel several months to win the girl's favor because she was very cautious and patient, not in a rush. Although she shared Samuel's desires and dreams, she was 11 years younger than him. Otelia was concerned that the man had already been divorced twice. And when they finally got married, a couple of years after they met, Otelia became pregnant. Soon, their long-awaited son was born, and they named him Norman. Norman Soto grew up as a strong and talented young man. He loved to draw and read books, played football with his friends, and went skiing in the winter. His parents cherished and adored him, so they decided not to have any more children. Norman was enough for them. They lived in a small town in the north. The boy soon grew into an intelligent and ambitious youth who wanted to pursue higher education, live in a big city, work for a major company, and earn a lot of money. Norman spent 2 years trying to get into university, and he succeeded, of course. He chose a city not too far from his parents so that he could visit them on holidays and vacations. His parents greatly appreciated it. But when the young man was in his 3rd year of college, his beloved mother, Samuel's wife, Otelia, fell seriously ill. The family took her to various medical facilities, but it was already too late. There was no cure for her illness, and, at the age of 48, the beautiful Otelia passed away. Samuel and his son were overwhelmed with grief. Everything had happened so unexpectedly and quickly that neither of them could believe it. Norman didn't quit his studies, thinking that his mother wouldn't have wanted him to. Samuel was angry at his son for what he considered to be improper grieving, at his departed wife for leaving too soon, at his sisters for not coming to the funeral, and, in general, at life for treating him so unfairly. For nearly a year after the tragedy, Samuel lived in isolation. He hardly interacted with anyone except his young son, who would call or visit occasionally. Samuel had been retired for many years, but to prevent boredom, he continued to work at the local sawmill, mostly operating machinery or assisting the workers. He no longer hoped for anything good or significant in his life. But, of course, fate had more gifts in store for Samuel. Norman settled well in the city, excelled in his studies, found a job at a decent company, bought an apartment, and eventually found love. Her name was Julia, and she not only fell in love with Norman but also with his father, Samuel. Julia had been an orphan from a very young age, and Samuel Soto strongly reminded her of her beloved grandfather, who had taken care of her until her adolescence. The old man liked the girl too because she reminded him so much of Otelia. So he began hinting at his son, asking him to propose to her. "Not often do you come across good and worthy young women," he said. Norman listened to his father. They had a modest wedding in the city where the newlyweds lived, with a small circle of friends, and the only invited relative was Samuel Soto. Friends wished Julia and Norman prosperity, happiness, financial independence, and, of course, children. And then, the bride, in her beautiful white dress, stood up from the table and announced, "Thank you all for your well wishes. One of them is about to come true very soon." She placed her hand on her belly and smiled, anticipating the guests' reactions. Norman, of course, knew about this, so he also beamed with a wide smile. Everyone began to exclaim and cheer with joy, congratulating them. Only one person, a guy from Norman's workplace named Jacinto, sat with a frozen expression on his face, not understanding what had just happened. "Oh my goodness, Jacinto! Julia is pregnant. What's wrong with you?" exclaimed a red-haired girl, apparently his girlfriend, and tapped him on the shoulder. Not the most perceptive, Jacinto also rejoiced after that. He raised a glass of champagne and enthusiastically said, "To the newlyweds and their future happy family. Hooray!" And everyone echoed with a resounding hooray. After all the celebrations, as the guests began to disperse, Samuel Soto, who had been silent almost all evening, approached the family and said, "At first, I wanted to say, 'Welcome to the family, Julia.' But after today's joyous news, I want to add, thank you for bringing a wonderful person into this world. I will help you in any way I can, if you wish." The old man was deeply moved. He was truly happy, almost as much as when he learned of his own child's arrival. "I thought, Samuel, maybe if it's a girl, we could name her Otelia." Julia responded after their long embrace, but the grandfather objected, simply saying, "No, my dear, name the child with your own name so that she doesn't have the same fate as her grandmother." Samuel found it bitter to say this, as he still had not fully recovered from the loss. Perhaps he never would. And so, 7 months after the wedding, a lovely blue-eyed child, resembling both her father and mother, was born into the world. It was a girl. The young parents heeded their grandfather's advice and gave her a completely different name, Eleonora, but they affectionately called her Nora, with the emphasis on the first syllable. They continued to live in the city as a family of 3, visiting the grandfather in the village every 6 months so that the little girl would grow up closely acquainted with nature, unafraid of being alone with it. Samuel Soto cherished his only granddaughter. She was as bright as the sun, so free-spirited and active as children should be, knowing no sorrow or worry. Unfortunately, this lasted for Nora only until her 5th birthday. Because on the day after this celebration, her mother took the car and headed to her relatively new job. But alas, she never made it to her destination. Norman could not believe that this had happened to him. He fell into a protracted depression, took various medications, and visited different doctors. In the end, he had to entrust his beloved daughter to his father for 6 months, and Samuel welcomed his cherished granddaughter without hesitation. "Grandpa!" Nora exclaimed when she saw her only grandfather upon arriving at his village. She looked tired and could barely walk, stumbling over her own shoes while running. Her disheveled hair was hastily tied into 3 ponytails. Her clothes were wrinkled. "Hello, my dearest. How did your trip go? Did your head spin this time? Didn't you get car sick?" Samuel Soto asked the little girl as he was hugging her and removing the small backpack from her delicate shoulders. Norman stood a bit apart. He had become noticeably thinner, with a weary expression on his face. He looked untidy overall, holding a large pink bag filled with his daughter's belongings. The old man wanted to have a word with his son, so he addressed the little girl. "Sweetheart, go inside and ring the bell. Maybe there will be a tasty chocolate candy or a lollipop waiting for you." He approached his son, embracing him by the shoulders, but Norman just stepped back, thanking his father for the help. He handed the bag to him and, as the bell rang, drove away, waving goodbye to Nora. The little girl was not naive. She had a keen sense of the world and was sure that her father was not doing well and that he was suffering greatly. Of course, she missed her mother too. She wasn't there to help her or sing her a lullaby at night. It was awful for a child at such a young age to attend a funeral, especially for her own parent. It was terrible that the girl lost her mother, who was supposed to be her role model. "There are no candies in there, Grandpa," the upset girl shouted when she grew tired of reaching for the bell hanging on the door. This bell replaced a regular doorbell and also served as a nice decoration. The only thing it occasionally annoyed me with was its prolonged jingling during strong winds. "Of course not. Why would there be? Here, take this." The old man pulled a piece of candy out of his jacket pocket and held it in his open, trembling hand for the girl to take. She grabbed it right away, and they entered the house together to sort Nora's things and prepare lunch. 6 months of living together with her granddaughter went by imperceptibly. The old man taught her to read and count, to pay attention, and even to make songs by drumming wooden sticks on the table or a tree stump. Nora enjoyed living with her grandfather very much, going for walks in nature, reading interesting books, playing, and even swimming in the river. She spent the summer wonderfully in the village. One of Samuel's neighbors also had her grandchildren over for the holidays. There was a 10-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy, just like Nora. The children often played and hung out together, so the time spent in the company of her grandfather was quite lovely and carefree for the little girl. But Norman got better. The medications helped him recover. So he called his father to tell him of his upcoming arrival. "Nora, come here, sweetheart." The old man called his granddaughter after the conversation. "Daddy will be back soon, and you'll live together again." Hooray! The little girl started jumping for joy, missing her father very much. "Will we live here together, the 3 of us?" she asked with hope in her eyes. But Samuel Soto just hugged her and chuckled sadly. He understood that it would never happen, and soon he would be alone in his house again. Norman finally arrived a couple of days later. His father heard his car's engine and peered out the window. He brought a sweet gift and a stuffed teddy bear the size of a hefty village cat for his daughter. To the old man's surprise, his son was not alone. A woman with nearly white hair was following him from the passenger seat of the car. Her body language indicated she was not happy with this trip and didn't want to be there. The grandfather called Nora from her room as she was almost ready to leave for home, saying that her father had arrived. The little girl leaped out like a frog and rushed to the door. As she opened it, they embraced tightly and kissed each other on the cheeks, noses, and foreheads. Then they slowly entered the house. It was only inside the house that the girl noticed the presence of a stranger. The woman was standing there with a disapproving expression, showing indifference to everything that was happening. She wore a brown coat unsuitable for the weather and black high-heeled shoes. She clearly straightened her almost white hair by herself, as it appeared too lush and lay unnaturally on her shoulders. The first thing that caught the eye when looking at her was her thick black eyelashes, either glued or artificially extended, and her brightly painted lips. "Let me introduce you to Marina. We've been together for several months now, and we got married recently," Norman said, a little embarrassed. She gave a barely noticeable smile, trying to appear friendly, and looked at the old man and the girl. "Marina, this is my father Samuel and my daughter Eleonora." The new woman did not immediately endear herself to the father's daughter. A negative energy radiated from her, palpable to everyone in the room, except, apparently, Norman. Nora didn't move from her spot or greet the woman, so she took it upon herself to sit down next to the girl, squatting, and greet her. "Hi, Viola. Nice to meet you. Daddy told me so much about you," Marina said with her slightly squeaky voice, reaching out with her hand with long red-nailed fingers towards the girl. "I'm Nora." The girl replied shortly and indignantly, then fled into her grandfather's room. Marina reached out again and stared at the old man, much like Norman had. He subtly gestured to his father, as if to say, "Be polite." So, Samuel Soto stood up and shook the woman's hand, saying, "Nice to meet you, Marina. Would you like to stay for some coffee? I was just about to put the kettle on." The old man clearly didn't like what he was hearing. This woman might have been all right, but she was definitely not the most pleasant person, especially in comparison to the wonderful Julia. "No, thank you. We need to get going, right, Norman?" she said playfully, touching her husband's shoulder. Norman just smiled and repeated her words. "Yes, it's time for us to go." Then Norman looked around the room, noticing some children's belongings, and let out a meaningful sigh. "All right, I'll gather Nora's remaining things and bring them out to you. We need to say goodbye," the old man said as he started picking up toys from the couch. Among them lay a hand-knitted bunny that Samuel had bought for the little girl. They had gone to a craft fair, and she had fallen in love with it at first sight. Such love couldn't simply be let go and forgotten, and Samuel certainly knew that. The old man tapped on his own bedroom door, where the little girl was hiding. Through the door, he could hear quiet sobbing. Then, sobbing and sniffing, she called out, "If that's Daddy, go away. I'm not going anywhere with you." But the grandfather only knocked again, using their secret code, 3 times in a row, then a pause for a second, and 2 more times. "Come in," Nora responded, recognizing the secret code. The old man entered, and by then, the girl had already taken out her things from her bag, angrily scattering them around the room. She sat curled up on the floor, hugging her knees. The old man groaned, lifted her onto the bed, and sat down next to her. The little girl continued to cry. "Nora. Nora, my dear. You need to go with your father. Marina might be nervous now, but she might become better later. You might even like her. People deserve a second chance, especially when they're your relatives, even if they're newly acquired." The old man spoke this speech not only to convince his granddaughter, but also for himself. It was unpleasant to learn such things from his own son, and the young woman appeared somewhat vague in appearance and quite unpleasant in character. It hadn't even been 6 months since his wife's death, and he had already found someone else. Did he ever consider his daughter when he married another person? Probably not. At least, that's what Samuel Soto concluded. She sincerely promised to be obedient and brave for him. They then began gathering the scattered belongings once again. Later, at the doorstep of the house, Nora pulled her old childhood rattle out of her bag, which she had adored in her youth, and handed it to her grandfather with the words, "Grandpa, this is for you, don't forget me." There was such terrible sadness in her eyes, although the little girl did her best to pretend that everything was all right. On her head, her grandfather had braided crooked plaits. He didn't know how to do it properly since he never had a daughter. Her lips were chapped and wind-bitten, and her nose displayed barely noticeable freckles that hadn't faded from her face yet after a sunny summer in the countryside. However, Samuel Soto, deeply upset by her departure, held back his impending tears and responded to her with immense tenderness. "This is simply impossible, Nora." They embraced once again, kissing each other on the cheeks. The girl dashed out of the car and rushed as fast as possible, given the heavy bag on her shoulder. Norman started the engine, seated his daughter in the back seat, and within a couple of minutes, they drove away, not even waving goodbye to Samuel. A few weeks later, the old man's condition worsened significantly. He fell seriously ill, lying in bed with a high fever, unable to even lift his head, let alone perform his household tasks or prepare dinner. In his feverish dreams, he saw his ideal life. The picture was so beautiful and vivid that it could easily become a reality. Otelia was alive and well. Together with Samuel, they were sitting by the campfire, drinking coffee, and hugging, just like in the past. These were their kind of rendezvous and outings, which they organized whenever possible, almost every week. Then, they would pack their belongings into a basket and head home. But their home was much larger and more spacious, as their son, Norman, lived with his family under the same roof. Of course, there was the delightful Julia, Nora, and two other children they dearly wanted to have. These were the twins, two blue-eyed boys named Timoteo and Marcelo, who greatly resembled their father. In the yard, there were two dogs. One was a hunting dog, and the other was a lovely, curly white beauty, which would be nearly invisible on the snow in winter if not for her pitch-black eyes. In an adjacent kennel, there would be a young goat that provided delicious sweet milk, from which the family made their homemade cheese. At home, kittens would sit on the windowsills, born to the same mother cat. The family would gather together on cold winter evenings around a large round table in the middle of the dining room on the first floor. Nora would put on concerts and showcase her drawings created in a day or a week. Julia and Otelia would be busy in the kitchen with the dishes and preparing food for the hardworking men and obedient children. The twins would peacefully sleep in their nursery or sit on high chairs next to their father and grandfather while they wiped food off their chins and hands. Then, they would all head to their respective rooms to sleep, wearing warm and comfortable pajamas and embracing and bidding each other good night. They would meet again the next day for breakfast, greet each other, and wish everyone a good day. These were truly the best dreams one could imagine. And how dreadful Samuel felt when he woke up and realized it was all unreal, just an unfulfilled dream. The caring neighbor, Claudia, helped him, brought pills, and brewed coffee with cinnamon for him. But Samuel's condition didn't improve, so she called for an ambulance. At the hospital, they couldn't diagnose the old man precisely, so they advised him to worry less, spend more time outdoors, drink plenty of apple juice, avoid lifting heavy objects, and only walk with a cane to avoid straining his legs and back. Among the suggestions to improve his well-being, the elderly man was advised to find friends or get a pet. He liked the second option better, of course. So, when he was discharged from the hospital, Samuel visited an animal shelter. He had recently become adept at getting around with a cane with relative ease, and a stroll around town seemed like a possibility. Even though it was a larger neighboring village rather than a city, it felt like a metropolis to him. The shelter was genuinely tiny, resembling a small stone prison cell with a couple of windows with grids. Upon entering, a plump girl, probably in her 20s or younger, greeted him. She looked tired and had earplugs in her ears. Taking out one earplug, she asked him, "Are you here for the animals, sir?" The old man nodded, and she continued, "To adopt or to take home or run away?" The old man raised his index finger, indicating that he wanted to adopt. That was precisely what he needed at that moment. The girl gave a slight smile, removed the other earplug, and put her devices in her pocket. It wasn't surprising that she was wearing earplugs. It was incredibly noisy in the shelter. Dogs were barking loudly, cats were meowing carelessly, someone was knocking on the cages, and they clanged against each other. "Who would you like to adopt?" "We have dogs, cats, and one goat," offered the employee, leading the old man into the shelter's common area, where all the aforementioned animals were housed. There weren't that many of them, around 10 cats and roughly the same number of dogs. The goat lived in a large cage at the end of the corridor, but it wasn't spacious enough for her to move around comfortably or even lie down. A wave of pity and sorrow overwhelmed the old man for all these little creatures. Of course, he couldn't afford to take them all or even part of them, but he still decided on a larger company. "I would like one cat, one dog, and that goat," he said. The girl's eyes widened. No one had ever wanted to take so many pets at once, let alone a goat. "The goat, just for you to know, doesn't produce milk," she warned him. But Samuel didn't mind. He was already standing, searching for some sad, just like himself, cats and dogs. Among the cats, he liked a three-colored cat named Noddy. She was quite calm and gazed directly into the man's eyes. He was so captivated by her gaze that he couldn't look away. "I want to take Noddy home, and please help me choose a dog that won't harm the cat or the goat," the old man said. In a couple of minutes, they suggested he take home Guacho, a short-legged, long-eared pup who was around a year old. The dog was reasonably friendly, according to the shelter worker. Now, the only question was how to transport Noddy, Guacho, and the goat Franca to Samuel's village. From another room, a nearly bald young man with slightly slanted eyes emerged and said, "I can give you a ride home with the animals. We'll load them into my pickup, and we'll be there soon." And now Samuel Soto was sitting in the passenger seat of the pickup, glancing back to make sure the poor animals, who had no idea where they were being taken or why, were okay. They secured the cages to minimize the jostling, but it didn't help much since the driver didn't handle the vehicle very gently. After half an hour, they arrived at the old man's home, unloaded the animals onto the grass, and the happy young man drove away. After the new pets had settled down a bit after the journey, he opened the cages and released them one by one. First, the cat, who instantly liked the windowsill in his little house. Noddy laid down on it immediately to bask in the sun. Guacho was released next, and he began to frolic on the grass and enjoy his freedom. When Samuel fed him some meat, he understood who the master was and who he should have obeyed. The goat was initially reluctant to leave her cage, but the remaining green grass lured her out, and she fell asleep almost immediately near the man's house. She slept so comfortably that Samuel Soto himself felt like taking a nap. Noddy obviously loved warmth, as she crept up to the dozing old man and lay beside him on the bed, as if hugging the man. Samuel had a new little family. The old man, of course, continued to walk with a cane and to deal with his ailments, although his health had greatly improved. That's how he lived with his troop of pets. He worked a bit to have something to feed them. He often called his son, or more precisely, his granddaughter. Nora asked her dad to call Grandpa. She picked up the receiver, and they chatted for 5 to 10 minutes about everything in the world. Nora told him about her kindergarten, her friends, her dolls, and the cakes that her neighbor Marta treated her to. Samuel Soto, in return, shared stories about his pets, their antics, and how they entertained him. However, the stepmother didn't allow the girl to stay on the phone for long, so she quickly took it from her. You could hear her distant scolding on the other end of the line. Sometimes, the grandfather would ask his granddaughter if she was being treated well at home. But the little girl wouldn't respond or change the subject. A year had passed since they parted ways. And then, one day, at lunchtime, when Samuel came home for lunch as usual, the phone rang. He picked up and heard someone's heavy breathing. "Dad." Norman sounded sad and frightened. What happened? His father immediately understood that he had bad news, but he was impatient. "What's wrong with you? What about Nora? Tell me." "Nora passed away. Please, come. The funeral will be held at the following address." Samuel Soto was in shock as he was writing down the address on a piece of paper. He said nothing to his son, he just quietly hung up the phone and sat on the couch. He had been sitting there for 4 hours or more, completely forgetting about work, dinner, and sleep. His body wouldn't move, his throat was dry and aching, and his legs felt like they were frozen. But eventually, he came to his senses. Noddy helped him with that, as she was sitting on his lap, warming him with her fluffy body. The next day, Samuel packed a bag, taking money and his granddaughter's old rattle that he kept on a shelf by the entrance. He asked his caring neighbor Claudia, who had been looking after him, to feed his animals, leaving a large supply of meat in the freezer and a gift for her on the table, a lovely potted flower with a note. He had intended to give her the flower already, but now there was an added reason. The journey was long, but by his calculations, he should make it to his destination on time. He couldn't understand why the funeral was taking place not in Nora's hometown, but in some remote village that required 3 transfers on different modes of transportation: a train, a bus, and a minibus. The whole trip would take a day and cost a lot of money for an old man, but how could he not go? How could he abandon his son at such a terrible moment? How could he not say goodbye one last time to the brightest person ever? Samuel pondered his life and all the sorrows and misfortunes it had brought him. Only it gave him a chance at love, happiness, and luck, which it snatched away just as quickly. He himself no longer wanted to exist. Yes, he would give himself to the angels in exchange for his granddaughter's soul, but alas, no one offered him such a deal. During the trip, the old man slept a lot to avoid thinking about his overwhelming state. "Dad, you've come," Norman said, seeing his father on the doorstep, "even though you didn't make it on time." Samuel was convinced that the funeral would take place the next day, but according to his son, they had to hurry. The exact reason was unclear, but the girl had been buried the same day Norman had called his father, almost 2 days before the old man's arrival. Then the son even hugged him and patted him on the shoulder. He wiped his tears and invited his father inside. It was a large 2-story house that, judging by the photos, belonged to Marina's family. There were old photographs from 20 years ago. The family was clearly not poor. While he examined the photos, Marina came out from another room and waited for him to notice her. But the grandfather was too absorbed in the process of looking into someone else's past. Marina cleared her throat, and Samuel finally looked at her. "Welcome, Samuel. This is my parents' house. They're doctors. They'll be back from the forest soon, and you'll meet them. It's such a pity what happened to Eleonora. It's sad that you couldn't make it to the funeral." She seemed completely indifferent to the fact that her husband's child had died. She was dressed in a bright pink sweater and gray pants, showing no signs of mourning or support for Norman's grief. "Sweetie, show your father the guest room." The girl turned around, flipped her hair, and walked away. "How could you marry her?" Samuel suddenly blurted out, instantly regretting it. But Norman didn't take offense or react to the comment at all, as if it had never been said. The grieving father simply said. Marina handled the service herself, and the funeral went smoothly. "I'll get you something to eat, and then we'll all go to the cemetery." The tiny village could be circled in just 40 or 45 minutes, so they walked to the cemetery, Samuel with his cane, Norman, and Marina, who sighed discontentedly from time to time. The girl's grave was at the other end of the cemetery, so they had to pass by the ancient gravestones with life dates. People buried there were mostly of old age. Samuel's only thought was that there was no place for children there. The fresh soil on his granddaughter's grave was still damp and very loose. Samuel couldn't get over this situation. Why did a healthy 6-year-old girl die out of the blue? According to Norman, there was no violence. He had just entered her room, and Nora was lying on the floor, clutching her stomach and not breathing. Marina's parents, both doctors, stated that there was nothing they could do to save her. There was no autopsy, as in this remote place, when someone died, they simply died, and nobody was going to transport a child's body to a mortuary or involve the authorities. All of this felt wrong, at least to Samuel. A gravedigger walked around the cemetery, fixing other people's gravestones, straightening flowers, and pulling out weeds. Norman kissed his daughter's grave, which was inscribed with beloved daughter and granddaughter, and stepped away from the grave to give the grandfather some time alone with the child, if that could even be said. Our story's hero kneeled beside the grave and started to cry. He didn't want to say anything, as words would just vanish into nothing. Through tears, he only softly repeated her name, Nora, Nora. After about 10 minutes, the man took a rattle out of his breast pocket, kissed it, and placed it next to a fresh flower wreath. The lightweight rattle almost sank into the loose soil. Then he got up and walked back in the direction of his son, who was already at the exit with his new wife. But then the old man remembered the flowers he had seen on his granddaughter's grave. These flowers were purple with a yellow center, very pretty-looking flowers on a sturdy and fluffy bright green stem. He had seen such plants in his home when he and his friends, Southerners, roamed the forest and feasted on delicious berries. Everyone ate only the fruits they were familiar with. But one boy named Enrique became uncontrollable and wanted to take a risk. The kid saw the beautiful flower with small red berries next to it, showed them to his friends, and swallowed them all without sharing them with anyone. Greedily, he smirked and said, "They're bitter." But before anyone could make a sarcastic comment, Enrique clutched his stomach. He felt nauseous, and the kids hurried him out of the forest to get help in the village. The doctor asked Samuel, the most sensible of the kids, for details about the berries Enrique had eaten. He described the purple flower, and the doctor scolded them and strongly warned them not to do such things again. Children, that was a deadly nightshade. A terrible and dangerous fruit. It could have killed you. Never eat anything you don't know for sure. Enrique survived, but the lesson stayed with the kids for the rest of their lives. Many decades later, Samuel recalled this incident just before reaching the exit. The elderly man ran through the cemetery, leaping over pits and avoiding graves and monuments as he did. His wooden cane significantly helped him during this dash, otherwise, he would have gotten stuck at the entrance. However, there was no time to waste, as every minute counted. During his frantic run, Samuel shouted for the gravedigger with a shovel to hurry up and help Nora. The man jumped up from his place as if his life depended on it and began to dig. "Dig, Roy, dig quickly." Samuel shouted at him as he himself knelt down, grabbed handfuls of soil, and threw it aside. Norman and Marina were watching, aghast. Norman's eyes were brimming with bitter tears, but he stood rooted to the spot, not moving a muscle. Marina was going out of her mind, fearing to touch Samuel. The gravedigger, David, continued to dig without saying a word, not digging too deep as Nora's parents had hurried her burial. Samuel touched the hard wooden coffin lid and knocked on it. "There she is. Get her out. Open it quickly," the old man commanded once again. They quickly cleared the soil from the coffin and opened it. Inside lay little Nora in her blue dress, holding the same gift from her grandpa, a knitted bunny in her arms, crossed on her chest. "Call a doctor. A real doctor. Quickly," Samuel shouted. David once again obeyed and rushed to the church located at the entrance to the cemetery. Samuel wiped his hands on his jacket and pants, pulled the little girl out of the wooden box, and pressed his fingers to her chin, trying to find a pulse. "What nonsense is this?" Marina began to say, but Norman interrupted her and went to his daughter. "She has a pulse, it seems. Norman, check her pulse too, on her wrist." He did so, and then his eyes widened. He also felt a weak pulse. Then he scooped up his daughter and carried her into the church, while the dusty and disheveled Samuel followed him, sparing a glance at Marina's disappointed face. She was standing in a tense pose, not concealing her anger. In the end, they soon took the little girl to a hospital in a nearby city, where the doctors connected her to 4 drips and various beeping instruments, stating that Nora was not dead but merely in a coma. She had miraculously survived because there was enough air due to the loose soil and poorly made coffin. Just a little more, and they wouldn't have been able to save her. "You did a great job bringing her here." The doctor praised Norman and Samuel, who breathed a sigh of relief and sat on a bench in the waiting area. But suddenly, the doctor returned and addressed the family again. The tests showed that the girl was indeed poisoned by deadly nightshade, and it was mashed, not whole berries. And this statement brought them back to reality. It was time to tell the son what Samuel had suspected all along. "Norman, I think Marina poisoned Nora." But before Norman could begin defending his wife, Samuel covered his mouth. "Think about it. Nora couldn't have eaten a berry she didn't recognize, especially mashed into puree. I taught her not to eat everything indiscriminately, but to carefully examine each fruit she found in the forest. She's a very clever girl and would never have done something so foolish. Marina was angry when we dug Nora up and took her to the hospital. She knows her herbal remedies well because she has lived here all these years. Her parents are doctors. Just believe me, son, the truth is right in front of you. The old man almost cried when he said all this, but Norman just froze in place, saying loudly and distinctly, "Stop it. I won't listen to this. Marina would never poison my daughter. She loves her too. Dad, just get out of here. Just leave." Norman turned red with anger, waved his hands, and stormed out of the hospital. The hospital staff didn't allow the old man to see the girl since he was only a distant relative, and there was no point in visiting her if she hadn't woken up yet. So he headed to Marina's family home to gather his belongings. However, Marina was already waiting for him at the doorstep with the old man's bag. When he got close to the house, she boldly stated, "Grandpa, you can't break up our marriage, no matter how much you wish for it. Get out of here quickly. Here are your things. Goodbye." At this point, Samuel didn't hold back and expressed to this lady exactly what he thought of her. "You're a murderer. You wanted to kill my granddaughter. You don't care about anyone but yourself. Stay away from my son. Stay away from our family." But this only made her laugh, and she just said one more thing. "Take the girl with you, or maybe something else bad might happen to her." Then she smiled, like a Cheshire cat, and disappeared behind the heavy front door. She was definitely threatening him, so the old man had no choice. Samuel stayed in a cheap hotel near the hospital. And when he learned that Nora had woken up and was recovering, he arrived at the hospital before her father. He gathered her belongings and secretly took her out of the hospital and the city. But they didn't report the girl as missing. Perhaps Marina advised Norman not to do so and simply called his father. When the grandfather and granddaughter arrived at their family home, they informed Norman of their arrival, and he was not opposed to it. Nora quickly adapted to life with her grandfather. Although they felt somewhat awkward around each other after a year of separation, Nora loved her grandfather's new pets. Nadi immediately took a liking to the girl and often pestered her for affection. Guacho enjoyed walking with the girl in the woods. Franca, the goat, was never sociable, so she continued to laze around on the nearly dried up grass near the house. "We need to build winter shelters for Franca and Guacho, otherwise they might freeze. Nadi will stay in the house to keep us warm," Nora said when the first cold weather set in. "Actually, Nora, I have already started building shelters for them. Those pieces of wood in the backyard are for them," replied Samuel, who was preparing pea soup for dinner. Harmony returned to the house. Samuel felt much better, almost no longer needing his cane, which he used only on long walks in the forest. Winter promised to be cold and snowy. Fortunately, Nora hadn't started school yet, but Samuel still began teaching her to read, write, and count. There was nothing better on a frosty day than sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee, wrapped in a blanket, and reading children's stories and poems by Rafael Alberti. Vendo nubes de colores. Los redondos, colorados. Para endulzar los calores. Samuel was reading, simply loving the straightforward children's rhyme. And soon, Nora learned to read and recite poems by heart. It didn't happen overnight, but the little girl made significant progress. She clearly inherited her mother's talents. Claudia, their neighbor, often visited Samuel's family, bringing fresh pastries and chocolate candies. She claimed to have made them herself, but couldn't eat them. However, she was probably just lonely. That's why she came over. "Claudia, why do you visit us so often? Don't you have your own things to do?" Nora playfully remarked, not realizing how rude it sounded. Her grandfather immediately scolded her, but Claudia just laughed and said, "I like you both too much. You're so cheerful and caring." She looked sweetly at Samuel and blushed. He also lowered his gaze and chuckled. There was clearly something between them, but Nora didn't understand it due to her young age. So, Nora and Samuel Soto lived together for many, many months. They lost count. One snowy evening, when the weather was particularly fierce, with strong winds howling through every door and window, there was a knock on the door. At that moment, everyone who could be in the house was inside: Samuel, little Nora, the cat Nadi, the dog Guacho, and even the goat Franca. The girl didn't want the last two to stay outside, although they had their well-insulated houses in the backyard. So, she convinced her grandpa to bring them inside. Luckily, the animals were well-behaved and calm. They huddled around a portable heater, which warmed up almost the entire house, and drifted off to sleep. "Maybe it's Claudia, and she's frozen?" Nora suggested. However, the old man didn't rush to open the door. He went to the window and peered through the curtains, hoping to see something in the darkness and the storm. But right in front of the window, he saw the face of a person on the other side. Of course, it startled him, and he jumped in surprise before recognizing the man. It was Norman, but he looked completely different, overgrown, and disheveled. He had a thick beard that curled at the edges and the same style of mustache. Samuel immediately let him into his home. Norman was soaking wet, covered in ice on his clothes and beard, and nearly collapsed upon entering. The sudden appearance of this stranger frightened the goat, who began to bleat and tried to retreat to the far corner of the room. But Nora approached her, soothing and petting her. "Dad?" Nora asked with astonishment. The family had never expected to see Norman. They sat on the couch and listened to his story. Everything happened just as the old man had anticipated. Marina pressured Norman intensely. She aggressively wanted to have children with him, although he was against the idea of more offspring. She wanted to force him to quit his beloved job in the city and move to a remote village near her family. She wouldn't let him go for long. She constantly criticized and belittled him. The final straw was when she began saying terrible things about Eleonora, his late ex-wife and the mother of his child. Norman then saw his wife's true colors, recalled his father's words about the herbs, and decided to leave her. Of course, a jealous woman wouldn't let him go so easily. So, under the cover of night, he gathered his belongings and escaped. "Where else could I go? I came here. I have no one else but you," Norman said, and his daughter moved closer to him, hugging him tightly. They forgave him, at least his affectionate and peaceful daughter. However, the respect and trust of the elderly father had to be earned, especially considering that his son had not listened to him for the past few years, had abandoned his family, made foolish mistakes, and almost buried his own daughter alive. In the end, the three of them lived together as they had never done before. Usually, Samuel either lived alone or with his wife, Nora, or with his wife and son. It felt like a different life. Samuel Soto told his son to find work in the village if he wanted to stay there because he wouldn't be able to feed 3 human mouths and as many animals on his own. He struggled with the financial aspects of their lives, and he needed assistance. Norman approached the situation with the utmost responsibility. He visited all the homes and workplaces in the village, looking for any kind of work. In the cold, snowy winter, this was quite problematic. People in the northern region usually worked during the warm, dry months and rested and reaped the rewards of their hard work during the winter. However, this didn't mean the whole village was sitting idle. There were lumberjacks and people who delivered firewood to homes, essentially providing a delivery service for groceries and the like. These jobs were typically performed by strong men with excellent physical conditioning and good stamina. Additionally, warm clothing was a must. Then fortune smiled upon Norman. He was offered part-time work, chopping wood and delivering it to homes, especially to the elderly who couldn't do it themselves. One of these delivery points was his own family home. The pay wasn't substantial, but it was enough for their family, and they managed to save some money. Less than 6 months later, their daughter would need to start school, requiring expenses for school uniforms, textbooks, exercise books, writing supplies, a backpack, and so on. Norman and Samuel wanted nothing but the best for their little girl. Remember the old man's dream when he was seriously ill? The dream of an ideal life with his wife, son, and his family, surrounded by their domestic animals. This dream almost became a reality, except for the unfortunate loss of his wife. Samuel lived in the same small house with his only son and his granddaughter, who had grown significantly since then. They both worked, but they never forgot to educate the girl, investing all their energy into her. Animals filled their home, alleviating the sadness and loneliness that occasionally settled over the house on cold evenings. Soon, the little girl grew up and went to school. She excelled in mathematics, and in her later years, she excelled in physics and chemistry. In her free time, she helped her dad and her grandpa with household chores, hung out with friends in the village, and took care of the elderly goat. When she finished school as a beautiful and intelligent young woman, she didn't want to stay in the village for the rest of her life. Yet she had no intention of leaving her beloved family behind either. Darling, go study, and if you want, come back later. After all, you have the internet. Maybe you'll work with a computer? Samuel implored his granddaughter. He always wanted the girl to pursue her dreams. He couldn't stand in her way, especially since he was very old. The last few years before his granddaughter reached adulthood, they and Claudia transitioned into a new level of their relationship, close friends. Although, according to Nora, they had a little and sweet romance. Norman, too, didn't persuade his daughter to stay in the village with them. He even agreed to let her live in a university dormitory. In the end, Nora passed her exams with high scores and got a government-funded spot at her dream university in the nearby city. When leaving, she cried bitterly, promising that she would come home during the first holidays, call every day, and send gifts from the city if her scholarship allowed it. Neither her father nor her grandfather held back their tears either. They hugged each other for a long time and kissed as they waited for the bus to arrive. When the time for their farewell was prolonged, Samuel pulled a small object from his pocket and handed it to his granddaughter, saying, "It's for you, so don't forget us and come back. We'll always be waiting for you." Nora responded, "It's just impossible, Grandpa." But there, on the horizon, they saw the approaching bus. They all stretched out their arms, ensuring that it would stop. They told each other that they loved one another multiple times, and Nora took a seat by the bus window. She waved to her tearful family, and soon, after just a couple of minutes, she wiped away her tears, then unwrapped the towel in which her grandfather's gift lay. Of course, it was a knitted bunny he had bought for her over 13 years ago. The very same bunny that they had almost buried alive in the evil stepmother's secluded home. The toy appeared worn and dirty, as though it had been sitting at the bottom of some well all these years. The girl hadn't seen it since then and couldn't understand where he had retrieved it from. Nevertheless, this bunny truly reminded her of many things. While she was examining the toy and getting lost in memories, someone sat down next to her and began speaking with a young and gentle voice. "Did you knit this cute bunny yourself?" Nora looked up, and there was a young man her age or slightly older with green eyes, light hair, and tiny dimples on his cheeks when he smiled. He didn't wait for her response, staring at her in surprise. He just extended his hand to her and added, "I'm Daniel, what's your name?" And so, a new chapter in Nora's life began. Ahead of her were days filled with adventures, both joyful and sad. Where would she be without them? And this was not the end, it was just the beginning.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.